You can just click on this. Slideshow. Good? All right. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I've been asked to give a talk about the honeybee. My name is Abdullah Felten, and I'm a bee farmer, a honey farmer. So in this talk, we'll be describing a bee's life, what their roles and responsibilities are, and how they produce honey and other things in their hive to survive. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وأوحى ربك إلى النحل أن اتخذي من الجبال بيوتا ومن الشجر ومما يعرشون. And Allah has inspired the bee to make their homes in the mountains, the trees, and in what they construct. As we see here on the left, we have bees making their home in some mountains, inside the trees, and me farming some honeybees. Okay. Me working with some things that are constructed by mankind. Some hadith regarding honey. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri reported that a man came to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and said, "My brother has diarrhea." Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Give him honey to drink." The man gave him honey to drink, and he said, "I gave it to him, but his diarrhea only got worse." The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Allah has told the truth, and your brother's stomach is lying." He gave him more honey, and he was cured. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anh said, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "There's healing in three things: hijama, a drink of honey, and cauterization with fire. But I forbid my nation from using cauterization," or something to that effect. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anh said, "You must make use of two healers, the Quran and honey." As we'll see later, there's an ayah in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that honey is a cure for mankind. So which one's the honeybee? A lot of times people see yellow and black or striped things flying around and they say, "A bee is around me, it's going to sting me." It's not this one in the upper left corner. That's a mason bee. This is a character of a bee. It just looked cute. This is actually a fly that really likes honey, and it's striped yellow and black, but it's not a bee. This is a bald-faced hornet. This one over here is a bumblebee. Here's another mason bee. This is a wasp. And finally, we have our beautiful honeybee in the lower right corner. For comparison, one time at a bee yard, a little mason bee landed on my hand. So I put a honeybee next to it to see how tiny they really are, mason bees. On the right is another mason bee. They're very good at pollinating, but they don't colonize like bees do. They live kind of alone. So how did I get into beekeeping? I was a teacher, a high school science teacher in the country of Kuwait. And while there, I decided I wanted to learn how to practice hijama from the hadith that I just mentioned before about there being shifa in the practice of hijama. And on occasion, they wouldn't use hijama on certain people. They would use honeybees and sting people, especially those that have immunosuppressive disorders, such as MS or rheumatoid arthritis. So when I came back to the USA, I decided to try to introduce honeybee sting therapy with hijama, but many people don't know about it. And as I had a few beehives, the honey kept coming and everyone knew about that. So that kind of turned into our business of beekeeping. Alhamdulillah, over the last 3 years, we've had 50 hives that we've managed each year. So what's the buzz? There's a few terms that are used that are somewhat confused, such as a colony of bees. What does that refer to? The colony is referring to the queen bee and all the other bees that are around her, but the actual structure they live in is called the hive. Brood is referring to baby bees when they're in their egg phase all the way through their larval and pupa phase until they hatch. And a swarm is when a colony becomes so strong that there's not enough space inside the hive for that many bees, so they'll decide to split. And here on the right, you can see a picture of me holding a branch that had about 5 to 10 pounds of bees hanging off of it. And that was a swarm from one of my hives. So different honeybees. Honeybees are either male or female. The males are referred to as drones. They have very large eyes and a very large body. So they're easily distinguished between worker bees, the female bees. Female bees are known as workers because, as you'll see, they do a lot of work. And we have the queen bee. The queen bee, there's only one. The female worker bees, there's thousands and thousands of them inside a hive. And you can tell by looking at the abdomen that a worker bee's abdomen only goes as far as their wings, but the queen bee's abdomen goes very far. This particular queen bee is marked with a red dot, and that is because it helps beekeepers see her better. It is when a colony becomes so strong. So for example, if I'm looking in a hive, at peak season, there can be roughly 60,000 bees in a hive. And because there's only one queen, I don't want to damage her. If you look at the picture on the right, if you can try to find the queen bee in that picture, you see that all those colors kind of merge together. If you can see her, she's in the upper right corner. But she'll blend in with all these other bees. And what we'll do is we'll give them that colored dot depending on what year that queen was born. So, for example, in 2023, the color was red. And that's why I marked this one red. Queen bees can live up to 5 years roughly, where worker bees only live for about 4 to 6 weeks in the summertime. So because that queen bee lives so long, it's ideal to know when exactly she was born. Is she a year-old, 2-year-old? I had a few queen bees this year that were 3 years old and they passed away, but they live a very long time. So each type of bee, the queen, the drones, and the worker bee all have specific tasks in the colony. Drones only have one set of chromosomes. The responsibility that they have in the hive is to mate with a queen bee. That's it. They'll fly out, they'll all congregate in drone congregation sites, and they'll wait for a virgin queen to fly towards that area to mate with. Roughly 12 to 15 drones will mate with that queen. They can go to any hive. Worker bees can only go to their hive. Drones can go to any hive and they won't be kicked out. The workers will feed them, they can take rest, and then they can venture back out to try to find a virgin queen to mate with. Drones cannot sting. They have a different anatomical appendage than female bees. Female bees have stingers, but the drones don't. Now the queen. The queen has 2 main responsibilities. The first one is to lay eggs. She can either lay female eggs or male eggs. That's determined by the way that the worker bees construct the hive. And we'll be looking at a photo of that in a moment. If she lays a fertilized egg, that means 2 sets of chromosomes, it would be a female worker bee. If it's unfertilized, it only has 1 set of chromosomes, then it's a drone. So this is an example in nature where you have one set of chromosomes coming from a female to make a male with one set. At peak season, when it's warm out around July, a queen bee can lay up to 1,500 eggs a day. So that's her first responsibility that I mentioned. And here we see, how does she lay eggs? All of these little holes that we see in comb are called cells. If it's a small cell, she'll measure it with her antennae, the diameter, and she'll lay a fertilized egg so that we can have a worker. You can see that all of these cells have a capping on it, a top. That is where worker bees are going to be born from. At the bottom here, we see these long peanut-shaped cells. That's where queens are going to be emerging from. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 queens that this colony is trying to make. If you look on the right, we have a lot of flat cells that are capped. Those are worker bee cells. To the left, these kind of look like protruding bullets. They're more rounded. Those are for the bigger bees called drones. So if you look at the bottom, we see these cells with large diameters. And the queen bee will measure that with her antennae. And inside it, she'll lay an unfertilized egg. The other primary function of a queen is to produce queen mandibular pheromone. Around each queen, she'll have a group of bees that tend to her. They'll clean her, they'll feed her, but they'll also take that queen mandibular pheromone from her that she produces, and they'll carry it throughout the hive. So they're called retinue bees, these bees that are around her. They'll take that away, they'll carry it and pass it along to all the bees throughout the hive. This gives the worker bees, a sense of it has a calming effect on the bees. It gives them a sense that they belong and that they have a queen. It also inhibits the development, or it represses the development of their ovaries so that they can't lay eggs. If they lay eggs, they're all virgins, so they don't have any chromosomal material from drones. So they can only lay eggs that are unfertilized, meaning they can only lay eggs that are drones. But drones don't do anything. But what does the worker honeybee do? They rear the baby bees, also known as the brood. They feed drones. They're the ones that build the comb inside the hive. They keep the hive very clean. They're the ones that forage for food. They protect the hive. They're the ones that can sting. And if need be, they replace the queen. A queen, as a female, is from a fertilized egg. So if a queen dies or if she gets damaged, the worker bees will kill that queen, their mother, and they'll take any fertilized egg and they'll make a new queen from that. So here's a honeybee life cycle. Some of the pictures, this upper left pictures of some eggs that we can see. They kind of look like little rice grains inside the comb. And a bee will be in an egg state for 3 days. This numbering system on the right is the number of days that it takes from the time that the queen laid the egg until they develop into a larva, a pupa, and then finally hatch. SubhanAllah, the queen will hatch in 16 days. As far as efficacy of a hive and survival, a queen bee hatching first is at the top of the list. Without a queen, you don't have eggs. Without eggs, you don't have bees. Without bees, you don't have a functioning hive. So she's the most important thing if anything happens to her. Second in line would be the worker bees. They take 21 days to go from egg until a functioning bee when she hatches. And finally, you have drones, which their only function is to mate with a queen. So for survival purposes, they take the longest at 24 days. Here we can see some bees feeding and taking care of some other bees in different stages of larval stages. And these are not capped yet. You can see here on the chart that these are days when these cells are uncapped, and then they finally become capped in a cocoon-like state until they eventually hatch. As the bee ages, from the moment they hatch, they go through a series of responsibilities inside the hive. From days 1 through 5 of being born, they'll hatch out, and their primary function is to clean the cell that they came out of and become familiar with the hive. They'll also be introduced to their mother, the queen, through that mandibular pheromone. So kind of getting them an idea of where they live and what to do. On day 6 through 12, they are now termed nurse bees, and what they'll produce is a type of jelly on something on the back of their heads, glands called pharyngeal glands. They'll give a little bit to the developing larva, and those larvae will bathe in that nutrient bath, and that's their food, kind of like a chicken egg with the yolk and white, and they'll develop inside that. On the right, we see various queen cells, and we can see a lot of that jelly inside there. That's called royal jelly. A queen bee is fed exclusively that and a large quantity of it. So a lot of times it's popular for people to take it as a supplement because a queen bee will live for up to 5 years as opposed to a worker bee, which will only last for about a month and a half. They only eat a little bit of this jelly, but a queen eats so much of it. So because she lives such a long time and is able to be developed and born so much faster at only 16 days, some people kind of treat it as a fountain of youth. Allahu Alam. Days 13 through 18, their primary function is wax production and being an undertaker. So wax production occurs when there is something called a nectar flow. A nectar flow is when you have different flowers blooming, producing nectar, and you'll have one in the spring, and then when spring is transitioning into the summer, there will be a break, like about 2 weeks, and then you'll have a lot of different flowers blooming throughout the summer, and then you'll have another break, and then another flower bloom or nectar flow in the fall. During these phases of nectar coming in, that sugar will stimulate wax glands on the bee's abdomen, and this will be the building blocks for honeycomb. So the bees will build all of these cells with that wax. They'll cap the developing bees with that wax so they can develop in their cocoon. And then here on the right is an image of fresh comb that's white. As it ages and the bees tread along it and more bees are hatching out of it, it becomes darker. And all the way at the bottom, you can see that this comb is almost black. This comb is probably 3 to 10 years old. I have some comb like this that's very old, about 10 years, and it almost looks black. And if you look in the picture to the left, you can see a couple bees already starting to hatch. But it takes a lot of energy and effort in order to just produce this comb. First, they have to get the nectar, they have to produce it, and then make this comb so they don't let it go to waste. They'll actually reuse any comb that's damaged and rebuild it. So part of the undertaker duties of a bee, of this female worker bee, is they will clean out debris out of the hive. They will throw out any dead larvae. This particular image is of something called chalk brood. Chalk brood is caused by a fungus where the brood will be eaten by the fungus, and it makes that brood look chalky, and we call these little things mummies. But the bees will clean that out and throw those mummies out at the entrance of the hive so that It's not in the hive. The hive is a very clean place. They'll also throw out any bees that may have died. If a bee knows that it's going to die, it will fly out of the hive to go die. It won't stay in and die. But should it die inside the hive, bees will carry it out. If there's any spill of nectar or rainwater or something that gets on the bee's comb inside their hive, they'll clean it up immediately. This image is of frames inside a hive that I have, where I separated two boxes and the bees had put honey inside comb that they built in between the frames. Immediately, the bees just went to that honey to start cleaning it up. And here's a picture on the right with them kind of circling around a little puddle that formed. Also at this day range of their life, they will turn nectar into honey. When nectar is gathered from honeybees from different flowers, they'll bring it to the hive. It'll be stored in these cells, and the bees will fan that honey, and their own heat, their own body temperature will heat up that nectar until it eventually turns into honey. That's at about 18% water, 82% sugar. Once it hits that point, it typically won't ferment, and that's what honey is. Once it reaches that, they'll form wax cappings, which they put on top of it to seal it. Wax is naturally hydrophobic. That means it will repel water. So any humidity changes, or if it rains, it won't allow moisture to get into the honey. If moisture does get into the honey and the honey gets too wet, the naturally occurring yeast that's there will make it ferment. And then the bees won't eat it. From day 19 to 21, their responsibility is to guard the hive. So here we have some bees guarding an entrance. And we'll see in a moment what they're guarding from. If we have a weak colony, beekeepers will usually use something called an entrance reducer. This reduces the amount of space that the bees have to guard. Honeybees, the females have stingers that are barbed. So when they sting someone or something, that barb will stay in that person or thing. And the function of a bee's stinger is to protect the hive. As opposed to here on the right, a yellow jacket, their stingers are used for hunting. It's smooth. So a honeybee can only sting one time and that's it. Where a yellow jacket can repeatedly sting other wasps and other things. They can repeatedly sting so they can hunt for their food. Here's some creatures that a honeybee would be guarding from. Yellow jackets are notorious for trying to get into the hive to try to get access to the honey stores, also stored pollen, which will be coming up soon. Ants love to live in bee colonies for some reason. I would imagine it's because of the sugar in the honey, but this is seen quite often. Spiders can always be seen around beehives, perhaps to catch either them or other insects that would be interested in the things that they collect. Wax moths. These are one of the most fearsome things that bees have to deal with because they can really destroy the honeycomb. The picture in the lower right is of wax moth larvae. Their primary desired food is stored pollen, and all the stringy stuff becomes very difficult for the bees to walk on. It's very sticky, and they could get tangled in it, but wax moths can destroy a hive. Another thing they're trying to guard the hive from is the entrance of mice. Mice can destroy an entire hive, will eat all the comb, the honey, the pollen stores, and they'll build a nest in it. Another one is hive beetle. Hive beetles are after the pollen that's stored in the hive, and they're not necessarily a creature that's going to hurt the bees, but they leave some type of a slime that makes honey taste very bad. Here's a look at a frame from one of my hives where a mouse had gotten in the hive over the winter. Mice love to go into hives for several reasons. They have a wonderful source of food. They have protection from the elements, but also the bees stay very warm in the wintertime. So they have a nice little heat source, protection from the elements, and food. But here in this hive, a mouse had destroyed the comb in this area where it's lighter comb, and the bees had repaired that after I kicked the mice out. So day 22 until the end of the life of a honeybee, so this is week 3 of their life, up until about week 6. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ثم كلي من كل الثمرات فاسلكي سبل ربك ذلالا يخرج من بطونها شراب مختلف ألوانه فيه شفاء للناس إن في ذلك لآية لقوم يتفكرون. Then eat from the fruits of the path made easy for you. Exiting from their bellies is a drink of different color. In it is a cure for mankind, and indeed, in that is a sign for the people who ponder or think. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the bee with what we can see anatomically as having 2 stomachs. بطونها, the stomachs of the bee. They have a honey stomach where they will go to a flower and collect nectar. They'll store it in their stomach and in their honey stomach. And the rest of the second stomach is meant for their own digestion of what they need. Bees will take this nectar back to the hive and they'll pass it to a bee at the entrance. And that nectar will be passed on until it's stored in the honeycomb. Here we have bees also collecting pollen on the back of their legs. Pollen is the bee's primary source of protein, vitamins, and minerals. Pollen is the gamete or the sex cell of a plant, but bees will use that for food. The nectar is their carbohydrate source, which they will concentrate into honey. So here we have some images of bees bundling up pollen into pollen grains. At this point, when it's balled up like this, we call it bee pollen as opposed to flower pollen, and them taking the nectar from flowers. So how the process works. A honeybee will forage at the end of their life for pollen. They'll put those pollen grains into the cells that they built, and they'll pack it down with their head. You can see the different layers and different colors from different plants that the bees had collected from. At this stage, that pollen is called bee bread. It's mixed with saliva, it's mixed with honey, and naturally occurring yeasts that will kind of ferment, and it has a bready smell and taste. So we call it bee bread. The bees will store that pollen around the brood nest. So it's very close next to the developing bees, and this is the source of food that they need to create that worker jelly to feed the larvae for the worker bees, the drones, as well as make royal jelly for the queen. And eventually, that's what gives you more bees. So bees need a protein source to make more bees. For nectar, the bees will fly around from flower to flower, collecting nectar, storing it in their honey stomach, passing it along to the bees inside the hive that aren't foragers yet. They'll store that inside the honeycomb. Once it's dehydrated down enough that it won't ferment, they cap it with a wax capping. Once a frame or a certain amount of honeycomb is capped, then now it's time, at least for honey farming purposes, to extract it with some fancy machinery or simple, and then it's bottled for our consumption. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that there's different colors, that this drink is of different colors, on the left is honey from the spring and summer of 2022. In the springtime, typically we expect honey to be of a light color, but for whatever reason, Allah knows, the honey that we got in the springtime was the darkest honey we've ever had. It was a very, very dark brown amber. Whereas this year, in 2023, in the springtime, the honey was very light, almost clear. And in the summertime, it's usually some type of a golden hue. This color comes from the different flowers that are blooming at the different times and different seasons. They also have a different taste. There's also a variety of colors in pollen. If we look in the center picture on the left, this is pollen that's been harvested from the summertime. You have browns and yellows and white. When the autumn time, throughout September, you get a very dark, rich orange color. This year in the springtime, we actually had blue pollen for the first time, which is very interesting to see. So the way that we look at wax or process it is the bees will first make these wax scales. I happen to find these at the bottom of a hive. If the bees had found them first, they would have taken them and reused them. But they'll chew that up, form our honeycomb, and for purposes of getting honey out of the comb, we'll cut all this top layer of cappings off and extract the honey by spinning out the honey in one of those machines. This is what we're left with, a bunch of bits of wax. We'll clean that into these wax bars that have a beautiful canary yellow color, and from that we can make candles, lip balms. Some woodworkers will make wood polish out of it. But back to the bees. How the bees organize their hive. If we look here in the picture on the right and on the left, the bees keep their brood nest toward the center. So the queen is laying her eggs in the center, and they surround it with their resources. Usually on the bottom and on the sides would be pollen, stored pollen as bee bread, and on the top and surrounding it is honey. Why this is somewhat important? Because any type of heat that's generated to produce the brood, just like a chicken egg has to be in an incubator, that brood has to be kept at a certain temperature. If it's too cold, they'll die inside those cells. So this honey is a good insulator. It'll catch the bees' temperature and their heat that they give off and be able to insulate that brood. In a typical hive, at the way bottom of the hive, at the base, this is called the brood chamber, where the queen is and she's laying her eggs. All of these boxes on top, which in this image there's 6, those are called honey supers. Supers means that you put this box in a superior position, so on top. But this is where the bees will store many, many pounds and pounds of honey. Another interesting fact about this, or how it is an example of the efficacy of bees and how they live, is that in the wintertime, the queen stops laying eggs so that the bees don't have to waste their energy or expend their energy raising new bees. There's nothing outside to forage from because all the plants aren't producing any nectar. There's nothing for them. So they need to stay inside and stay warm. So their honey being stored up in these areas, whether it's in nature or in these boxes that we've made for them, they will move up with their food and stay in these areas, these top areas where they have an immediate food source, but also heat rises. So instead of staying down, even just a difference of a foot for the bees, that difference in temperature could mean the survival of a colony over the winter or the death of that colony. I've already described the organization of putting bee bread in the brood nest so that the bees have immediate access to the food source they need to produce the food, that jelly substance for the worker bees and queen bee. If we look on the right, we see the comb. If you can imagine or kind of see how you have two sides of comb, and instead of the cells being constructed parallel to the ground, they're kind of on a slope. And what that does is it makes sure that when the bees are putting nectar into it, it's not just oozing out. Gravity will pull it down into those cells. And as they dehydrate it and it becomes more viscous, it will stay inside those cells until they cap it. So it's a very smart, efficient way for them to construct their comb. When a beehive becomes too congested, whether if it's because they don't have enough space or if the population has just increased to such a manner, the bees will begin to decide to build something called queen cups. It doesn't mean that they're going to make a new queen yet, but they'll build these queen cups in preparation should the event arise that they need to split. So here on the left is a picture of queen cells they're preparing. And at the right, they've committed, the colony has become too strong. They're now developing multiple queens. They don't just produce one queen at a time. They'll produce 5, 10, 20 queens at one time. And this is what we call swarming. It's kind of like if you recall, in high school biology where we have mitosis, where a parent or mother cell will start to acquire many materials so that it can divide into two daughter cells. In a bee colony, when there's too much congestion, that queen mandibular pheromone isn't able to spread enough to all the bees in the hive, they'll decide that we're so strong we now need to split. And they'll take female eggs that are fertilized and start to develop queen cells. That virgin queen that's inside the cell, she has the ability to sting, but a mated queen doesn't. So what they'll do is they'll chase their mother queen around and they'll stop feeding her for several days. At that point, now she'll lose weight and she'll be able to fly. And the queen, along with roughly half of the hive, will leave the original colony, and along with all those cells for the queens that have not hatched yet. So in here we have a picture of one queen and about half of the hive. Before they swarm, they'll consume all of the honey or most of the honey that they've been collecting in the cells. For what? So that they now have the sugar source inside them to start stimulating their wax glands in order to build more comb in a new place. So here's me trying to catch that swarm. I can't remember if I was successful or not. So now comes the time where the old mother queen, who is a mated queen, and half the colony has left. And this is what you'll be left with, where you'll open or observe a hive, and one queen has emerged. She'll emerge from the top, and she'll go around and start to destroy the other queen cells from the side and sting them to kill them. If 2 queens emerge at the same time, or 3, they'll fight to the death. And the remaining queen that's still alive, she'll be the queen of that colony. For beekeeping purposes, if I see this activity happening, I'll personally take some of these queen cells out so that whichever queen is going to emerge, she might have one or two other queen cells to destroy, but that will leave her enough energy that she can fly and go on her mating flight, because that requires a lot of energy. I don't want her to waste it on fighting other queens. So some lessons from the beehive are primarily around the efficiency that they use their resources. Honey and around above the brood insulates them, and they use it as their winter food. The pollen around the brood for immediate use. The reuse of wax, if anything is damaged, or if they find their scales, or if I even put comb that's already been used inside a hive, they'll reuse that comb. That means that they don't have to expend the energy to have to go harvest the nectar, and harvest the nectar, have their wax gland stimulated, produce all that wax for them to have to mold. It's already there, so they'll reuse it. Harvesting and saving enough for a developing colony before a swarm. When a swarm is leaving, I mentioned that they'll take roughly half, maybe more, of their stored honey, but they'll still leave enough for all of those nurse bees that are still inside the hive and the developing queen. Those bees that are left behind are not foragers yet, so they're going to need some honey to survive and live off of. Doesn't break off until strong enough. This is where you won't have a swarm until the colony is so congested and strong enough that they feel right to do so. If we look at the life of a bee and how efficient it is, where each stage of their life, according to their age and somewhat experience, will determine what responsibility and roles they have in the hive. The amount of energy and resources it takes to make one bee is a lot for the colony. So until that bee is at its last point, where it's done every responsibility for the hive, and it's served the hive enough that now toward the end of its life, it will risk its life by going out and foraging. If it dies while it's foraging by being eaten by a bird, or if it rains outside, or if it gets hit by a car, whatever the case may be, it doesn't make it home. At least that energy investment that the hive has made has at least been efficient and useful with that bee's life. I've mentioned reusing comb. Inside the hive, they only keep what's necessary, which is honey, pollen in the form of bee bread, but debris and all other intruders are not allowed. So in this case, what would be a lesson to learn from this is that we shouldn't have things that we don't need, and to keep our places clean. Bees are one of the cleanest creatures in that not only do they clean their hive and make sure that it's orderly and everything has a purpose, but they'll only relieve themselves outside. In the winter months, when it's very cold outside, if a single bee were to fly outside, the cold would absorb or take their heat out of their body almost instantly, and the bee would die. So they usually wait for a day that's 40 degrees, and then you'll have many bees going out on what's called a cleansing flight, where they'll all go to the bathroom and then they all come back in. This can happen if over a period of a month and a half that they're waiting for that moment. The biggest thing plaguing honeybees around the world right now is the varroa mite. This mite comes from, I'll say China, but to make it, I guess, more broad, we'll say Asia. Asian honeybees are able to take these mites out. They're able to smell if those mites are inside the cells of developing larvae, and they'll pull that larva out so that these mites don't have a chance to develop. These mites feed on the bees. They'll eat the fat that's on their bodies. And once a mite feeds on one bee and then feeds on another, they transfer diseases. Two of the biggest diseases that plague bees from these mites that they spread are deformed wing virus, where a bee will hatch and emerge, but she has deformed wings. She can't fly. If she can't fly, that means that they can't collect nectar or pollen, and that would be the death of a colony. The other is bee paralysis, which is also called, I believe, hairless bee paralysis, where the bees don't have any hair. They kind of look oily and shiny, and they're just shaking. And if the bees that are fine, and there's nothing wrong with bees, certain bees, if they see that bees have this issue, they'll kick them out of the hive, even if it's their sisters. Bees love flowers, and a lot of people plant flowers for them. But if anybody wanted to help bees in nature, they're really thirsty creatures. So another thing you can do is have a water source for them. This bird bath is in one of the yards that we have hives in, and a stone, but they're always inside these bird baths drinking water. Sometimes they'll also go to people's pools. But if you see a bee flying around you, they're probably just checking you out, or they're thirsty if you have a drink. In honey farming, do we feed our bees sugar? In this part of the world, yes. There's no nectar source. Roughly after the third week of September, so October, November, December, January, February, March, there's no food source for the bees. So after we've harvested the honey, we need to make sure we feed our bees and they have enough stored for the winter. In the upper left, there's a 5-gallon bucket of sugar syrup that I've prepared for them. And they'll be consuming that, taking it back to the hive and storing it. Here we have a bee that's cleaning off another bee that has some sugar syrup on them. When it gets too cold, though, as in right now, in our part of the world in Illinois, November, December time, it gets so cold that the bees won't consume that syrup anymore, but they will eat sugar in its solid form. So we will take about 10 pounds of sugar, melt it down, and form these candy boards, and that will allow them to feed and hopefully survive the winter up through February, March. If a bee has a source of sugar syrup and they have a source of nectar, they'll reject the sugar syrup. They won't consume any of it. They'll go toward the nectar. So another technique that beekeepers have in the springtime that we know that flowers are blooming is we'll be feeding our bees sugar syrup until we see that they're no longer feeding on the sugar syrup. That's when we know that we can stop feeding them because nectar has started to flow. Keeping it real. A lot of times people want to know if their honey is real or not. One, probably the most popular sign of people thinking it's not real is that it crystallizes. All honey crystallizes eventually. As you can see in these cells, the honey is crystallizing or starting to. It's almost as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala designed it in such a way that this now becomes a form for them to eat in the colder weather. For a beekeeper, this is very difficult, if not impossible, to get out of the comb. So we like to spin that honey out of the comb when it's in its liquid state. In fact, a common product that can be found at the shelves or that we make is something called creamed honey. That's just crystallized honey. But that is a natural process. Jazakumullah khairan for listening to my speech. Is there any questions?
Assalamu alaikum. I was wondering if you can discuss a little bit how bees communicate with each other. I know common knowledge is the idea of like the bee dance, If you can clarify that.
Yeah, bees communicate in two primary ways. One is by pheromones, and the other is just by movement and buzzing. Another pheromone that I did not discuss was alarm pheromone. So if a honeybee is attacking something, they'll fan that alarm pheromone, which other bees will pick up. And then you'll have many bees, hundreds of bees, that will start to be in an alarmed state. And any movement that they see, they'll immediately go and attack. So they're sending out that signal, and then they're all going to attack whatever that thing is that's moving. Other ways that they move, if a forager sees that there's nectar or a source of food somewhere, they'll venture as far as 6 miles away. But as far for it to be beneficial for a bee and their energy consumption, within the 3-mile radius of their hive, they'll find their food source. They'll then come back to the hive and do a type of dance, or they'll buzz around, depending on the position of the sun and the location from the entrance of the hive. They'll kind of circle around and show other bees where that is, and they'll kind of recruit them to come with them to go to that nectar source.
Jazakumullah khair. What do you do as a beekeeper to keep the bees safe from intruders? Like your interventions, not necessarily their interventions.
The only intervention that I take is primarily an entrance reducer. So that will reduce the amount of area that things can enter, which gives them less space that they have to guard. So it concentrates the guard bees at the entrance, that they only have to protect that small opening instead of a large opening. As far as protection against the biggest issue, which is mites, there's different chemicals that can be used that we will coat the bees with. For example, oxalic acid, which is wood bleach. We'll vaporize that in the hive. That will coat the bees with microscopic crystals that the mites, when they walk on it, it will lacerate their feet and they'll fall off. So they can't feed on the bees. That's primarily how we protect the bees against those types of intruders. Otherwise, you could also have raccoons as intruders. They just want to get in. For all intents and purposes, I'm an intruder. But we'll put bricks on top of the hive so that bees can't, or that animals can't knock it down to get inside. But the bees are very proficient at protecting themselves. Yeah.
So I saw this movie recently on, I forget what streaming platform, but it's called Haunting in Venice. And I hope I'm not ruining it for other people, but the murderer ends up using honey to kill or poison the victim. So it's a neurochemical that's harvested from the nectar of some of these flowers, and then they actually do their own bee harvest or honey harvesting, and she collects it and then feeds it to the victim. So is that something?
I haven't killed anybody with my honey.
But is that something that's possible?
Is that something that's possible? Chemically speaking, to have a lethal dose, it would have to be quite concentrated, I would imagine, especially if in the film a teaspoon of honey was administered. But as a doctor, I don't know, like, what would you say that a lethal dose would be?
No, what I'm saying is that something? Do bees themselves have some intrinsic safety measures where they won't go, foraging nectar from a flower that has some sort of potential toxin?
Well, I would imagine that certain toxins would not be lethal to a bee that might be to a human, or would have a certain effect on a bee that's not to a human. For example, royal jelly. it has a very distinct effect on a fertilized egg, where it will turn it into a queen bee and give her a very long life. But does it do it to a human? Allahu Alam. So the same way, if a human consumes something, but it would have no effect on a bee. It's the vertebrate, invertebrate type of maybe the mechanism of how things work. Are there certain chemicals in honey? Yes. The honey itself, it doesn't matter what kind of bee collects it. So they don't determine what type of honey is made. It's the flowers that are blooming that determine what type of honey is made. So, for example, there's a type of honey, I believe it's in Nepal, in the mountains, that the bees are foraging on a particular flower that may have a hallucinogenic effect. When people consume a certain amount of it, it will have that effect on a human, but it doesn't have that effect on the bee. And as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that there's a cure in that honey for mankind. Some places that sell honey, especially overseas, they'll say this honey is good for this honey is good for this. Allahu Alam. Most honey that's farmed is not monocrop, meaning it's not just from one plant source. It's wildflower. So if you're getting small hints of all these different things, you'll have, inshallah, a beautiful array of beneficial things and hopefully not as many harmful things. Did it say what type of crop this honey was coming from?
They mentioned the flower's name, the species of the flower. They did mention it. Yeah.
Jazakallah khairan. Let's see. I'm interested in becoming a beekeeper. What steps would you suggest to go about it? Where could I go to learn more and become a beekeeper? Alhamdulillah, most of what I learned was on YouTube. That's a wonderful source of information and doing things nowadays. As you start to look around of where to purchase your equipment and things, whether you want to be a hobbyist or whether you want to get more advanced, as some beekeepers do, and make it their profession, you'll start to meet people along the way just through buying. I plan to, inshallah, one day soon start to try to have some type of a gathering of Muslims that we can have and educate them on how to beekeep as hobbyists in their own gardens. There's a lot of Muslims in our area that have their own gardens in their backyard, and would want to tackle such a thing and become a beekeeper. But it's a lot. There's two different things to take into consideration. What I talked about today is a lot about how the bees live and how they're organized and what they do. But another thing is managing a bunch of little minds that want to do their own thing. And they kind of almost act like teenagers, where, some bees are like, just leave me alone. I don't want anything to do with you. Other bees are like, get away. And they don't want you in there, and they'll let you know it. So, alhamdulillah. You can always contact Felten Farms, and I would be more than happy to guide you through how to become a beekeeper. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, there's just one more. So do the bees see you as a threat, or do they recognize you as a helper and supporter?
That's a great question. That some beekeepers believe that their bees recognize them. It's my experience that they don't care who you are. You're an intruder in their hive. You could be gentle, and as long as when you're in a colony, for future beekeepers or even beekeepers that may be struggling with this, if you're slow and you're calm, the bees aren't going to hopefully sting you unless you grab a certain thing that they're on, like a frame, and you're pinching them under your finger. If you move too fast, or if you drop a frame or you drop something, then they're going to sting you. People that see a bee, whether at a picnic or something, and they start swatting really fast, bees attack fast-moving things. I don't know about wasps and hornets and those types of things, but a honeybee, If something's moving fast, they automatically take it as a threat and they'll attack it. So if you're moving cautiously and calm, then you'll be fine. So do they recognize me? I don't believe so. Because if I go into a beehive once every 2 weeks, and that bee only lives to be 6 weeks old, well, the first 3 weeks of its life, that's when it's in the hive. The other 3 weeks, it's going out and foraging. So I might open it once, they see me once and say, who's that scary thing in the white uniform? And then I close the hive. I might open it one more time a week later and they're already a forager out. So, yeah.
What's the total bee population for a colony? Averages?
Yeah, so in the springtime, after the winter, there might be about 10,000 bees. And that's also a survival mechanism because you want less mouths to feed in the springtime or in the winter. So now in the springtime, there's a lot of pollen in the air, as we know with allergies, but there's a lot of pollen being produced, a lot of nectar. That's when the queen starts laying again, and now that population starts to grow and grow and grow. At peak season, it's estimated that it's about 60,000 bees per colony.
A question, are there any ethical issues in kind of mass production of honey that you as a small business are addressing and kind of making sure to avoid?
Some people say that it's exploiting the bees by making them or utilizing their way of life and then taking their honey. I don't look at it as an exploitation per se. I look at it as me helping them grow to their fullest potential, making sure I'm managing this home that I put them in. The way that we get bees, they're bred in California, at least in the USA, they're bred in Georgia and California. They'll take a queen bee that's not the mom, they'll put her in a little cage, and then they'll shake inside a little box called a package, about 2 to 3 pounds of bees. So I'll take this package, I'll take the little queen cage, I'll put the queen cage in the hive, and I'll shake all the bees on top of the hive inside it, and I'll close it. And after about 3 days of her passing around her mandibular pheromone, the bees kind of accept her because they don't have a queen. This is the only one that's available. I'll let her out, and then she starts laying eggs, and they start taking care of her. So as far as me taking care of them, I try to make sure that they have enough honey left over. Bees will, in my experience, per hive will collect about 125 pounds of honey that I've harvested. I'll leave maybe 15 pounds, but 10,000 bees don't need 15 pounds of honey to survive throughout. They'll have that, but I also feed them sugar syrup and that candy board for their winter feed. And because this is my line of work, a pound of honey is worth a lot more than a pound of sugar. So that's why I'm in honey farming. But so as far as how anybody manipulates it, yeah, I don't think so. Beekeepers are usually well-intended people in the profession.
So just kind of piggyback on that, so in the wintertime you use this kind of sugar cream syrup or even solid sugar, and then in the spring and summertime you let them feed off of organic nectar that's
Correct.
available in the environment. When there are different types of honeys available in a store, and there's this, is this 100% raw or true honey? Can other honey sources be from just caramelized sugar as a source of nectar for the bees?
Any sugar source that's available to the bees when there is no food, they'll take advantage of it. So I used to have hives in Lombard, and it was next to a gas station. And whenever there was no nectar source outside, they'd be all over the garbage cans, trying to get any pop or thing that would have been thrown in the garbage. That happens especially towards the end of the year when you'll have bees, yellow jackets, all different types of flies, really trying to they're desperate for food that they can find in store. As far as anything like a tainted honey that you would buy from the store, I've never seen fake honey or funny honey. I've only had natural honey from that I've harvested. But even if I went to the store, I'll assume it's all real honey. The only real way to tell is to look and see microscopically if the grains of pollen in that honey are matching the flowers that are naturally occurring in that area. So that way you can tell this is real honey or not. As far as putting a lighter to it or putting it on the back of your thumb, Allahu Alam. Yeah. The best way is to know a beekeeper or honey farmer. Yeah.
But you can feed honeybees all sorts of garbage, and they'll
Any
still
sugar
make
source.
it honey.
Any sugar.
Any
well,
sugar source.
I don't know if it would necessarily be called honey. They'll store it, but what is honey is stored nectar, because they're collecting so many pounds and pounds of that. Could it be tainted with some Pepsi from a garbage can? Yeah, but what we call honey is from the nectar. Are there other things in it? Probably. Allahu Alam. But yeah. All right. We're just over an hour, and I've been asked to keep this at an hour. If there's any other questions, we'll answer them, inshallah, from now. We'll end with a dua, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq to and inspire us to be human and follow the sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as he inspires the bee to be a bee. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us to always do the right thing and to follow the path of Islam. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanallah wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta wa astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Subhanallah wa subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. I'd love to participate in a bee lab. Do you have any thoughts on a bee lab to answer questions in the field and expose Muslims to the methods in scientific inquiry grounded in the Islamic tradition? That'd be a better question to answer with some thought. If they want to email me, at the beginning of the presentation was an email, feltenfarmsllc@gmail.com. I would love to put some time and effort into answering that question, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.